Hey y'all, and welcome to Symbolic Logic. I am just going to quickly go over some of your homework answers, actually all of your homework answers for your first homework. So these are for homework number 1, which you turned in this Tuesday. I'll be finishing up grading those and getting them back to you in the next day or two, but I thought that we might discuss them here and I can give you a bit of a background on what the correct answers are. Okay. So your first assignment asks you to consider a series of informal arguments and to think about whether those arguments are valid or invalid. If they are invalid, you're supposed to provide a counter example to the argument. So the example, of course, we're given here is an invalid argument. The argument is kangaroos live in Australia. Sydney is in Australia, hence kangaroos live in Sydney. And we can see that if we put this into premise, numbered premise and conclusion form, we get something like this. Kangaroos live in Australia, premise 1. Premise 2, Sydney is in Australia, and the conclusion is kangaroos live in Sydney. But in fact, this argument is invalid because, and we can come up with a counterexample to show this. Imagine that kangaroos live everywhere in Australia, but because of some extreme kangaroo elimination procedures in Sydney, they've gotten rid of all of them. Well, then kangaroos would live everywhere in Australia except Sydney. And so that would mean premise 1 is true. Kangaroos live in Australia. It would mean premise 2 is true, of course, or that just follows from the way the world is. Sydney is in Australia. But the conclusion would be false. It would not be true that kangaroos live in Sydney. So it's possible for this argument to have true premises and a false conclusion, which means the argument isn't valid. Okay, let's look at the examples that you guys were presented with. I've taken the liberty of already putting these in argument, in premise conclusion form. And so here the arguments are. There's a small statement of the arguments right up here that you can look at. And so let's just work through these. Now, again, when we're moving from an informal statement of an argument to a numbered premise conclusion format, we want to pay attention to words that clue us in to the different function of the sentences in our argument. And so in this first argument, there are a few words that clue us into that. First of all, clearly, which is underlined here, is going to be a clue that the sentence that follows clearly is itself a conclusion. And then after all, we know, like because, serves to identify reasons for accept the thing that's supposed to be clearly true. And so what comes after all is going to be our premises. So with this first argument, we get the following format, just drawn over here with the arrow. So we can see the format of the argument is all squares are rectangles, all rectangles are parallelograms, and all parallelograms are quadrilaterals. And it follows from that all squares are quadrilateral. Like if you had something that was a square, premise 1 would tell us that thing would be a rectangle, and then premise 2 would tell us that thing would be a parallelogram, and then premise 3 would tell us that thing would be a quadrilateral. So any square is going to be a quadrilateral if these premises are true. And so this argument is valid. Let's look at our second argument. So the second argument in English, in normal English or a non-formalized method, says all logicians are philosophers. All philosophers study Kant. And it says then that it follows that all logicians study Kant. Well, it follows here will be, again, an indicator of the conclusion. And so this argument again looks to be valid, and we can demonstrate this using a Venn diagram. So I've drawn a Venn diagram here, which is essentially a diagram that uses circles to identify the relationship of different groups of things. So this one says all the logicians are in the group of philosophers. So if someone is a logician, they are a philosopher. And it says that all philosophers study Kant. And so it follows from this that the circle of logicians, the group of logicians, will be inside of the group, or will be a proper part of the group that studies Kant. And so it does follow from this that all logicians study Kant, and this is a valid argument. Now, with number 3, we get to our first invalid argument. So number 3 has the following format. Premise 1 is some reptiles are green. Premise 2 is all tortoises are reptiles. And premise 3 is some tortoises are green. But we can get a counterexample to this, and the counterexample is as follows. Imagine that only lizards are green. In other words, lizards are the only green reptiles. Well, in that case, it would still follow that some reptiles are green, the lizards are, and it would follow that, well, just given the way the world is, that all tortoises are reptiles, because they are. But then it would not be the case that some tortoises are green. So it's possible for these premises to be true while the conclusion is false. And so this again is an invalid argument, because we can provide a counterexample, an example where the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. And in general, when we're thinking of counterexamples, what we want to think about is just a story or maybe a picture that describes a situation where the sentences turn out true, but the conclusion doesn't. If you've shown that there is one of those things, one of those counterexamples, where the premises turn out true and the conclusion false, then you've shown that the argument isn't valid, because for a valid argument, that should not be possible. The next argument, argument 4, is again an invalid argument. So this has the following form. Either I stop smoking or I risk getting ill. So this is the first premise. Then the next premise is, if I stop smoking, then I will have withdrawal symptoms. And another premise is, if I get ill, then I risk death. And this argument concludes as follows. We know this is the conclusion because of the use of the word so in the ordinary English paragraph. And so this concludes with the conclusion, either I have withdrawal symptoms or I risk death. Now, this argument is invalid for the following reason. So let's think about what the first premise says. It says, either I stop smoking or I risk getting ill. But of course, someone can risk getting ill without never getting ill. Like I might eat some bad meat and risk getting food poisoning, but maybe I have a strong gut and I never get food poisoning, but because in that case. Or maybe, I risk getting ill from smoking, but for whatever reason, strong genetics or whatever, I just never do get ill from it. So imagine that I keep smoking and I risk getting ill, but I never in fact do get ill. Well, if I had gotten ill, we can suppose, I would have risked death. So that would make premise 3 true. And if I had stopped smoking, I would have withdrawal symptoms. So that would make premise 2 true. But what premise 1 says is, if I get ill, then I risk death. And that's what premise 3 says. And what premise 1 says is, either I stop smoking or I risk getting ill. But since I can risk getting ill without actually getting ill, it doesn't follow that I will risk death, because I'm merely risking getting ill, and risking death requires that I actually get ill. So this provides a counterexample to the argument. These premises can be true, but the conclusion remains false in this case, it seems. So this, again, is not a valid argument. It's invalid. Premise 5 is a bit of a weird argument because it's so short. It says, my friends are nice people, therefore my friends are nice people. And now I think we can think again about what it means for an argument to be valid. And so this argument appears here. And what it is for an argument to be valid is, if the conclusion or conclusions are true, then if the premise or premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. And that certainly seems to be the case with this argument, right? If my friends are nice people, then it follows that my friends are nice people. There's no way for for the premise to be true, my friends are nice people, without the conclusion, my friends are nice people, being true, because they're just the same thing. So this argument is a valid argument. If the premise is true, the conclusion has to be true. Now, that doesn't mean that this is a good argument. The problem with this argument is that it's circular. And what that means is that you already have to accept the conclusion in order to accept the argument or accept the premises for the conclusion. So this really doesn't give you a reason for believing the conclusion, since the premise itself is already equivalent to the conclusion. So this isn't a good argument, but it is a valid one. So an argument, it's important to note, can be valid while not being good. All right, number 6 says, it would save the government money to ban smoking. And then it says, as can be easily demonstrated. Now, I think here that the as can be easily demonstrated is a good indicator that what comes before that is the conclusion of the argument. So we know that the other things are premises. And so I think I would reconstruct this argument as follows, and this is down in the bottom right. Either there are not health problems resulting from smoking, or it would save the government money to ban smoking. Premise 2 is there are health problems from smoking. And so it follows, because we know that the not here, right? So this says there are not health problems resulting from smoking, but premise 2 tells us there are. So the disjunction that's in premise 1 will be true. Any disjunction will be true only if one of the disjuncts is true. But there's a kind of conflict between 1 and 2 that makes it the case the first disjunct of premise 1 is not true. So it has to be the case that the second disjunct is true for premise 1 to be true. So if premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, then the only way that can be the case is if it would save the government money to ban smoking. And so that conclusion follows if the premises are true. All right, argument 7. So argument 7 is one I've talked about before in this class. I've used it as an example of an argument that is valid but lacks true premises, so I hope no one got tripped up on this one. But what it says is dogs work for the Intergalactic Council. If dogs work for the Intergalactic Council, dogs are more advanced than humans. And then the conclusion is dogs are more advanced than humans. And we know this, right, again, because thus is going to be a clue word that that's the conclusion. So the conclusion of this argument is dogs are more advanced than humans. The first premise is dogs work for the Intergalactic Council. The second premise is if dogs work for the Intergalactic Council, then dogs are more advanced than humans. So this is a straightforward example of what's called modus ponens, where we have a conditional statement and the antecedent of the conditional is premises. And if we have a conditional statement and its antecedent, then the conclusion necessarily follows. So this argument too is valid. And then the final one is sort of the one that I had the most difficulty deciding whether or not it is valid. And I think an interesting thing to note here is that, I am a philosopher, I teach logic, but philosophy is about, in a certain sense, a kind of creativity of coming up with examples to demonstrate that something is false. So I felt that this argument was valid because I couldn't come up with a counterexample, but maybe you can. And if you can, if you explain that well in your assignment, then maybe you'll get some credit. Talking with groups today, I have realized that there are some interesting thoughts that people have on this. But anyway, here's my take. I think that the conclusion of this argument is essentially the first thought that's built into it. About the gods, I am not able to know whether they exist or do not exist. So I think that's the conclusion. I put that in the conclusion of this argument. The premises are as follows. The factors governing my knowledge are many. The obscurity of the subject, or preventing my knowledge, the factors preventing my knowledge are many. The obscurity of the subject and the shortness of human life. So I take this argument as saying there are two reasons for thinking I can't know whether the gods exist or don't. And those are, one, that the obscurity of the subject of the gods prevents me from knowing, and two, that the shortness of human life prevents me from knowing. And so if I am prevented from knowing these things, and these premises say I am, then it strikes me that if I'm prevented from doing something, that I don't do that thing. So I would say that there's not an example where these premises are true and the conclusion is false, because they're just saying these reasons prevent me from knowing, and the conclusion is only that I can't know. So it seems like this follows to me, but maybe people have interesting examples to it, counterexamples to the argument, and I look forward to seeing what those are. Okay, so let's look back here. Okay, so the second, or B, asked you to consider when to explain validity, explain when an argument is valid, or provide a counterexample to that argument. And so here's the first example. Okay, so people get wet whenever it rains. It often rains in Vancouver. Therefore, people often get wet in Vancouver. So I think that this argument is invalid. And so here's the reasoning behind that. Okay, suppose it is true that people get wet whenever it rains. Okay, so when there's a storm, people get wet. And suppose it often rains in Vancouver. Well, it may be true as a general rule that people get wet whenever it rains, right? That raining means people get wet. Maybe even the storms that are occurring in Vancouver get people wet, right? But maybe the people who get wet from those storms are, in Victoria, which is the town next to Vancouver. So when it's raining, people are getting wet. But suppose Vancouver itself is empty. No one lives there. I think that would provide a counterexample to this argument. So the counterexample would be, no one lives in Vancouver. So in that case, it could be true that there is this fact, people get wet whenever it rains. And two, that it often rains in Vancouver. But it is false that people often get wet in Vancouver because no one lives there. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, oranges are either fruits or musical instruments. Oranges are not fruits. Therefore, oranges are musical instruments. So this argument, I think, is valid. This argument has the following form, if we were to put it into formalized symbolic logic. A or B. A here stands for oranges are fruits, and B stands for oranges are musical instruments. So we have one, A or B, oranges are fruits or musical instruments. We have two, it's not the case that A. And then it would follow from this, and we'll be learning a rule that will make this clear in one step, that B has to be the case. And so the rule that you'll be applying later on is what's called a disjunction elimination rule. And that just says when you have a disjunctive statement and you have a negation of one of the disjuncts, then the other one has to be true. So this is how you would cite this in a formal proof. And right, this makes sense, right? If a disjunctive statement is true, one of the disjuncts has to be true. And premise 2 tells you that A is not true, so B has to follow here. I think that's pretty clear. Okay, what about this one? Some potatoes are not fruits. Some fruits are not oranges. So some potatoes are not oranges. So for this one, right, we can imagine some potatoes are not fruits. All right, so we have here the class of potatoes and the class of fruits. So there are various ways, oops, I didn't mean to write that there. That's class of potatoes. Here's the class of fruits. So it may be like this, right? There may be some partial overlap between these two. But one way for some potatoes to not be fruits is for them to be totally separated classes, right? This is also a way in which some potatoes are not fruits. Okay. Additionally, it may be the case that some fruits are not oranges. Maybe that works like this, right? So some oranges are fruits, and some fruits are not oranges. Or it could be even like, I mean, actually, the real state is like this, right? this is true as well. Some fruits are not oranges. Now, does it follow that some potatoes are not oranges? Well, no. Suppose that some potatoes are oranges. Let me redraw this actually. So we have here, this will make it clear. Some potatoes are not fruits. Some fruits are not oranges. Okay? So now some fruits are not oranges. All of these fruits, right, are not oranges. These are the fruits that aren't oranges. Some oranges are fruits. That doesn't have to be the case, but we can suppose it is, right? So this makes the two premises true. According to this diagram, some potatoes are not fruits. All of them are not. And some fruits are not oranges. But no potatoes are not oranges. All potatoes are oranges. Right? So this situation is such that the premises are all true, but the conclusion is false. So this argument is invalid. Any questions about that one? Right? Remember, we're thinking about what would be the case if the premises were true, and can we find an example where the premises are all true and the conclusion is false? And I think this presents such an example. Okay, all cartoons are illustrations, right? So we have illustrations and cartoons. All cartoons are illustrations. No photographs are illustrations, totally separate class. Therefore, some photographs are not cartoons. And that seems to be the case. All the things that make up this category, in fact, are not cartoons. Right? If all photographs are not cartoons, then some photographs are not cartoons. So this argument is valid. Yep, Owen? You're muted.
So if none of the photographs are illustrations, then would that make the conclusion any different if you were to rephrase it as no photographs are cartoons?
No. So if no photographs are cartoons, then some photographs are not cartoons.
But what if I struggled with this one a lot, and what I started thinking about was like, what if there was like an alternate category where like, oh wait, I see where I might have gone wrong. My initial idea was like, okay, they're all images though. You could like safely say, so there'd be like a bigger circle around all of it, but it would still follow that some photographs are not cartoons.
Right.
That doesn't really change that part of it. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, I think you might get hung up on some. Yeah. Some can be a confusing word. When we're using natural language, if I say some people failed the exam, right? The natural implication there is not everyone failed it, right? But that's merely an implication of what I've said. And there are tests for implications. The one is, can I contradict the implication without contradicting what I've said? If I can, then it's a mere implication. It's not built into the semantic structure of what I said. So I could say, some people failed the exam. In fact, everyone did, right? And I don't contradict myself in that case, right? So some does not imply not all, okay? I'm gonna plug in my computer real quick because it's about to die, and then we'll do the last few. Okay. Okay, so last ones. All valid arguments have only true premises. That one is false, right? We can come up with valid arguments that have false premises, right? Think about this argument. Oranges are either fruits or musical instruments. Oranges are not fruits. Oranges are musical instruments, right? So oranges are not fruits is false, but this is still a valid argument, right? So that's a counterexample to statement one. Statement one is false. Statement two, no valid arguments have a false, no valid argument may have a false conclusion. Is this true or false? You can do a show of hands if you want. Oh, Simon's hand was up. Is that the question from earlier, Simon? Okay.
Yeah, that was from earlier.
Okay. Yeah, so say yes if you think this is true, no if it's false. No valid arguments have a false conclusion.
It's false.
Yeah, this guy's false. We have here, well, in our examples here, I don't know if we have one. But I mean, in general, we've looked at lots of examples that have a false conclusion, right? I would say premise, the second argument has a false conclusion. All logicians don't actually study Kant, but it still remains a valid argument. All right, a valid argument can have false premises and a false conclusion. Yeah, that one's good. That's true. Right? I mean, look at this one. This is another, this serves an example of that as well. Actually, premise one is true, but forget that, okay? It's close enough. It has a false premise and a false conclusion. A valid argument can have true premises and a false conclusion.
That is true.
That is false. Remember, what is the property of validity? An argument is valid if and only if all of its premises are true, then its conclusion must be true.
Okay.
So it is, in fact, impossible for an argument to have true premises, a valid argument to have true premises and a false conclusion. A sound argument must be valid.
That's false.
No, that one's true as well, I'm afraid. Right, so what is the description of soundness? An argument is sound if it's valid and it has true premises. So that's built into it, okay? Soundness is like one step further than validity. If you get validity, it has the property that if the premises were true, the conclusion must be true.
Mm-hmm.
Soundness says, and the premises are true. So it just adds this extra thing on top of validity. A sound argument can have false premises and a false conclusion. True or false? This one is false because that's a property of soundness. That's the additional property it has over and above validity. Mm-hmm. So if an argument is sound, then you know the conclusion follows. It's like the gold standard for an argument. It doesn't only have the property that if the premises were true, the conclusion would follow. It has the property also of the premises actually being true. So it has true premises and a true conclusion, just necessarily given the nature of soundness.